we are live with At the Wheel podcast with myself, Joe White. I write the High Speed Radio Substack, and Tu Lee, my partner in crime here, with Sino Auto Insights. He too writes for Substack, and Simon Wright with The Economist. And we're here to talk about all things cars, China, the EU, all sorts of things. Quick, before we get started, I'm going to toss it to Tu to do a setup and an introduction of our topics with Simon. We're going to talk a lot about different companies and different things that are going on in the world of cars, in the world of trade and all. None of it's investment advice. Don't take that from us. But we'll offer our views of what we think is happening in the world of industry and the world of cars. Tu, take it away. Where are we going today?
So first of all, Simon, since I think a lot of our viewers will be in the United States or in North America, can you tell us a little bit about yourself first? And then one of the most interesting things recently was this article that you had written last week, I believe, for The Economist, titled Trump, Friend of the EV ? So I want to dive into that a little bit because I think Joe and I are a little bit more cynical than you are about
We're like, really? Yeah.
the chance that the D2.5 will be incented to transition quickly over to clean energy vehicles.
We can get into that. Look, yes, first of all, thank you for inviting me onto the podcast. What an honor it is to be here. Yes, I work for The Economist. I'm the industry editor, and I write about a fair amount of the sort of more old-fashioned industries. I write about aerospace, airlines, a bit of defence, shipping, logistics, supply chains, a bit of manufacturing. But the biggest bit of the job, probably half, if not more, is writing about the car industry, which I've done on and off for quite a while now. So hopefully, I have some insights into what's going on. I was just discussing before we came on that I haven't been to Detroit in an awfully long time, but my job is very global. So I, try and look at the industry from that perspective. So that's not just Europe, not just barely the UK, though I do occasionally write about the sad state of our car industry, but Europe, China, the US, and how the whole world sort of fits together.
Great.
And
so Simon,
really quickly, we've known each other for a few years now, right, Simon? I think you had reached out asking about Tesla in a previous article years ago. And so we've become friends since. We meet each other at auto shows, Shanghai, Paris, and we'll see each other in Munich in a week. But go ahead, Joe.
No, I was just going to say, Simon, it's an interesting job. And you're right. Sadly, being in London or even being in Detroit is probably not the best way to see the global industry from the right perspective anymore. But talk about this piece that you wrote for the Economist about Donald Trump, friend of the EV, because I think many of our viewers are going to think, wait a minute, what? This guy is the biggest enemy of the EV that the United States has had for a long time. So talk to that. What's the thesis here?
As you rightly point out, there was a question mark at the end of it, and I wanted to start with something that's slightly counterintuitive. Listen, I think what's going on is sort of interesting. By driving a sort of coach and horses through all the emission standards in America, it allows American car makers to produce far more of the more profitable SUVs and pickups than they would otherwise have done so. If the engagement ruling from the EPA goes, it means all emission rules will sort of disappear, as I understand it.
No, that's basically right.
The upshot of that would be that the American car makers will become more profitable than they otherwise would be. Now, look, they have the overhang of tariffs there, and we can see the damage they're doing. But if you look at Ford, for example, the damage from tariffs, $2 billion this year, the savings so far from not having to buy emissions credits, $1.5 billion. So in a way, this ruling will perhaps counteract the tariffs. If Jefferies, a bank, says perhaps even next year, they'll be making more money from the relaxation of the rules than they will be paying in tariffs. So in a sense, they'll have a little bit more money to spend. Now, the other part of this equation is how we think about EVs. In the US, of course, you have Tesla. Last time I was in the States was about a year ago. I was in Wyoming, so I didn't see many Teslas. But I did go to Jackson, which is very unlike the rest of Wyoming, and I saw a Rivian or two there and a Cybertruck. Yes, you do have Tesla, but you don't have quite the sort of array of EVs we have in Europe or indeed in China, where, you know, the penetration rate this year could be 60%, something extraordinary for new energy vehicles, which includes hybrids, of course. The thing about the American car companies is what do they do with if they have more profits? They can't afford to stop investing in EVs because they're global businesses. They will have to compete with those EVs made by the likes of Toyota if they finally pull their finger out, and other car makers that operate in the US. But also they're going to have to compete with the Chinese EVs where they operate in the rest of the world. So the other side of the argument is they simply can't afford to take their foot off the EV pedal. I think that in your last one you discussed Ford's latest plans, and I think that's just one example of how they're still pursuing EVs. In a sense, though, I think what the wider thing that of interest here is this is almost an experiment in letting the market decide. It's an experiment that the European Union would be wise to follow closely, I would say.
Yeah, Simon, I agree with you about a lot of what you just said. I think you're right that the U.S. auto companies would be fools to just say, okay, great, we can keep building things like what's behind me here, and forget about EVs. And I don't think they are fools. I think they know that you're right. And I would say another thing quickly, although I got a lot, you got a lot there that I really like, but in the United States, I mean, look at how, and this has been, several people have written about this lately. Look at how well Cadillac is doing with their electric vehicles. They're really gaining ground, gaining share with affluent Americans on the coast, the most affluent Americans on the coast. Those people want EVs because, you know, either because it suits their lifestyles perfectly, or they can afford to have 5 cars and trucks for different purposes. They don't have to worry. The point is, they want EVs, they want the style, they want the technology. And I think the American auto brands realize they have to cater to that. You can't let the most affluent consumers just go away and buy something else. So yeah, I'll let you comment, but those are off top of my mind, the things that make sense to me about this.
So as someone who is looking at September 30th as an American trying to purchase an electric vehicle before that $7,500 goes away, last couple of weeks I've been test driving some cars, and I do have to say I'm giving the D2.5 a lot more credit because the Mach-E drives really, really well. Okay, so my challenges or the issues I had before was that these cars weren't that compelling. They're starting to be much, much more compelling. And the tariffs, if they do protect the market for a couple more years, it should allow GM and Ford at least to bring more affordable cars. GM already has a $30,000 Equinox and a $40,000 Blazer. Those are pretty good cars as well. But, you know, Simon, I want to compare and contrast because you said let the market decide in the EU, but doesn't that concern you that Stellantis and Volkswagen will kind of be pushed out? Because as someone who's visited Shanghai recently and has test driven, you've ridden in a Neo from the UK. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that story and, you know, your experience in Shanghai with what you're seeing currently in the UK and parts of Europe with the Chinese electric vehicles.
Absolutely. I mean, what the sort of broad picture here, though, that I think we have to sort of get clear is the world is going electric one way or the other. I think it's not a question of if, it's a question of when, and it's a question of timescales. At some point in the future, it might be a couple of years, might be a bit more, we're going to not only see the total cost of ownership of electric vehicles become sort of equivalent to internal combustion engine vehicles, we're going to see sticker price parity. And once you get to something like that, there'll be almost no reason not to buy an EV. EVs are, for the most part, nicer to drive, more relaxing, sort of just easier to get on with, cheaper to own. So I think that this is the broad picture we're looking at. The world's going electric, and the timescales are the thing you have to look at. You talked about Neo. I mean, that's an interesting example. I think the problem with Neo is they haven't sold very many cars in Europe. I think I saw that they have this battery swapping technology, which, you know, works brilliantly if you own a Neo. But the sort of economics of swapping batteries is something I don't think they've really kind of conquered. And I saw some figures where there's there so few Neos have been sold. I mean, there's almost sort of, one battery swap station for every 25 Neos on the European roads. Don't quote me on that number, but it's not very many. But to get back to your point, what are we seeing in Europe? Look, Europe similarly, is protecting its car industry. We have tariffs on Chinese built EVs, which includes EVs built by foreign companies in China that are being exported to Europe. But in a way, I think I've always argued that the European car makers need that competition. They have to have their feet held in the fire. If that doesn't happen, I think they'll just sit on their hands and slow down the transition. Consumers should welcome the Chinese in Europe, but they're providing excellent EVs at a good cost. I think the car makers themselves should be thinking that, here's the competition. This is the time where we really need to start pulling our finger out and producing the kind of EVs that people want to buy. And I think you're right, Joe. I mean, I think not only it's not only happening in the US where there's some compelling EVs. The second generation of EVs from the sort of incumbent car makers are quite impressive vehicles. I haven't. Is it released? Maybe even today, the BMW's Neue Klasse of EVs on their new platform. The new Mercedes EVs look great. The Renault 5, I think, is an absolute triumph of an EV. It looks super cool. It's a great combination of sort of modern EV looks with the right amount of looking back to the original Renault 5. So I think there's a lot of compelling EVs coming. And I think there's this sort of narrative where the European car industry is sort of wiped out by the Chinese in a few years' time. And I just simply don't accept that. I think it's game on, and I think the Chinese have a lot of advantages, but I don't think we can completely write off the sort of incumbent European or industry, or even the incumbent car makers in the rest of the world. It's going to be a tough battle, and they're going to have to, accept that they're going to be losing market share, and that's something else we can perhaps talk about. But I think I'm
gonna stop both of you there, because should we? I actually believe you as well, Simon, that they're going to have competitive products, but they're not going to be as big as they were. Joe, for the D2.5, and then Simon, can you comment on Stellantis, Volkswagen? Renault is basically a regional player with the EU dominating, but I would consider Stellantis and Volkswagen still very much global. The D2.5 less so, or the D2 less so, Joe, but how much smaller do they get in order to get that competitiveness?
Well, I think that's the challenge. And I'll comment on it, and Simon, I want to come to you to ask what you see in Europe. But I think, Simon, you're right. It's when Toyota, I look at this to some degree, and I try to be careful about this, the analogy of Toyota in the 80s and 90s, when they kind of hit the shores with the Toyota production system and the super high quality product, all that stuff, blow Detroit out of the water, take them to zero. That didn't happen. But Toyota certainly did take a significant share of the U.S. market. They established manufacturing in this country. They're bigger than Ford, slightly less big than GM. That absolutely forced Ford and GM and the former Chrysler to be smaller. And as I think that did not happen without pain and without political, agita. And I do wonder, I was looking at the latest sales figures from Europe. They're a little hard to parse, but it sure looks like, SAIC/MG, right, and BYD, which are called out, they're gaining triple-digit percentages. And then you see, Stellantis's Fiat brand taking, cutting shifts, cutting production in Italy. And I'm going to guess, and I want you to speak to this if you can, that that's not okay, right, with the Italian government, with the Italian union. So I do think there's some tension that's going to have to be worked through here.
I think that's absolutely right. Listen, Chinese EVs, I think, account for 1 in 10 sales in Europe at the moment. They're going to increase. Who knows where they'll be by 2030? But if they have, say, 10% market share of a European market, mind you, which has lost significant volume from the pre-COVID era already, it means that these companies are going to have to slim down, and that's going to be very, very difficult. Volkswagen, the way Volkswagen is managed, it already has far too many expensive workers in Germany that it can't get rid of. The Oliver Blumer's plan to close factories, and it sounded great on paper, and then they rode back completely from that a few months later, and none of it is going to happen. But it's going to have to happen. For Stellantis, it's going to have to happen. You're absolutely right. I should point out that John Elkann and Exor own a big chunk of the Economist. So everything I say about Stellantis, you should bear that in mind. He's getting incredible stick in Italy at the moment from the press there, but partly because of the Fiat closures, partly because of selling Iveco to the, partly because of Magneti Marelli going bust. The Italians sort of blame the Stellantis, the merger that created Stellantis, for sort of shifting the central gravity from Italy to France. I mean, I think we could have all seen that coming, other than the Italians, but there we go. So you're absolutely right. The political problems of closing down car factories, it's incredibly hard to do, but the European car makers are going to have to cut capacity somehow. The question is now how they're going to do that and how that's going to come about. And I think it's going to be difficult, and it's going to cause them a great deal of grief. But where and how it's going to happen, I simply don't know.
Yeah, and I think it'll cause. I think the similar process could go on here in the United States, even though I think it's going to be a while. It's going to be a while before a lot of Chinese vehicles are imported to the United States. The will to block that, I think, it's obviously greater here than it seems to be in Europe right now. You have to qualify everything with right now, because things can change, right? I mean, a year and a half ago, the United States was going to, on its way toward requiring 50% plus EVs by the 2030s, as Europe, I think, is, at least on paper, committed to ending combustion sales by 2035. Well, our politics changed, and I wonder if Europe's politics will change. So, all these kinds of things, you have to it's going to be very dynamic, which is tough on an industry with 5-year product cycles.
It certainly is. And look, there's the sort of, the popular surge in Europe may indeed put an end to 2035, but other things might do as well. I mean, the fact that the car makers it's going to be very, very difficult for them to meet those targets. But I think setting a target and then sort of, if it's relaxed nearer the date, does it really matter if the date is 2035 or 2037? I mean, the aim here is to make Europe electric. The reason being for environmental reasons. If it's a couple of years late, I don't think that's going to be a disaster. That's not going to be a tragedy. But I don't think the car makers can be let off the hook just yet. But I suspect that nearer the time when it becomes obvious that it's going to be much, much harder to do that, there might be some. I'm sure the EU think of a word like flexibilities to cover up.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, I'd be very surprised if that doesn't happen.
But Simon, let me ask you, how firm is because it seems like an arbitrary date, 2035, number one. Yeah. Number two, is the political will still to keep that date, or is the pressure from the German and the other European automakers to push it out greater? Number one. Number two, because if you let the free flow of Chinese EVs into the European market, I'm sure you can probably hit that 25 date. But do you see potentially the price war getting exported into Europe and the UK from the Chinese? And I guess that's a multi-pronged question, but.
Well, that's a very good question. I mean, the Chinese are already in a price war in Europe, in that even though the cars they're bringing to Europe are their more sort of feature-loaded, upmarket cars, they're still a good deal cheaper than the equivalent European model. Whether that price war intensifies, I'm not entirely certain. I mean, it's doing the Chinese car industry in China no favors at the moment. I mean, that's a completely different question. We may not have time to address today, but I think they'd be reluctant to get involved in another price war, given the sort of damage it's evidently doing in China. But I think that the sort of broad thrust of your question about whether the Europeans are set on this. I mean, I think the EU isn't going to give ground yet, but I think one of the big questions, and one of the questions I think we'll be asking all the car executives in Munich next week, is what do they think about this? How do they see this sort of panning out? Because I think that's one of the big questions at the moment.
Yeah, I'm not able to go to Munich. I envy you that you are, because I do think that's going to be. I mean, the the competitive pressure from China, number one, the impact of the Chinese sort of the imbalances, if you want to use a nice word like that, in the Chinese industry on the rest of the world, number two, and then the pace of electrification, kind of whether these targets are going to be met would be. I mean, I'd be fascinated to hear what these folks have to say, because I would think that all the plans. I mean, I visited BMW going almost 2 years ago now when they went to do a piece about the Neue Class, and I heard all the stuff that BMW had to say about the ambitions for that and how they were doing all this stuff. Well, I wonder now, what they're going to do, because a significant chunk of the potential market for that vehicle, that car, the United States, the economics of trying to sell a compact EV have just gone upside down, at least in the short term. So it'll be interesting to hear what they have to say,
especially at their margin
about that.
Especially at BMW's margin.
At the 3 Series, kind of margin, yeah.
A plus 15% tariffs or wherever the tariff.
Right. Plus, or 25 right now, because they still haven't negotiated the
well, quite.
Yeah. So I mean, Simon, I'm interested, kind of what you think you're going to hear there, because I do think that all these European manufacturers, the Germans, are going to be in kind of a state about this.
Listen, I wish I knew what they were going to say. I mean, at the moment, I can't really second guess what the answer to that question is going to be, other than clearly going to, this long-term commitment to EVs is there, and it's going to be very hard to sort of significantly turn the boat around on him. As you say, they're 5-year model cycles, they're investments that were planned and made a long time ago. Making any sort of significant changes, given the sort of uncertainty as well. I mean, perhaps, in a few weeks' time, the Supreme Court will decide that all these tariffs are actually illegal, and they'll all disappear overnight. I mean, I sort of doubt that, but you know,
you should doubt that.
It's one of the problems for the car industry is it's been operating under such conditions of uncertainty for so long now that I simply don't know, and not just the car industry, any big company that operates outside the US but relies on how they make any sort of investment decision at all at the moment is a mystery to me.
I'm gonna correct you there, Simon. I think they're operating in a lot of certainty in China, and that's going down. A couple of things that make it even more interesting, at least on the premium side. If we look at Porsche, BMW, and Mercedes specifically in the China market, they have fallen off a cliff. Porsche specifically, Porsche creates, and Audi to a lesser extent creates flexibility for Volkswagen Group.
Yeah.
And their ability to build smaller vehicles. And so, how do you think the China market is going to negatively affect BMW? Because we still look at premium in the United States very traditionally, nice leather, improved interiors. But in China, the baseline is much higher. $1,000 vehicle, you get inside and it feels premium. And so can you compare and contrast that a little bit?
I mean, if I wanted to ask that question, that's sort of the question I would ask you, actually, as a matter of fact. But my understanding is, again, I should be answering the question that aren't asking them. But here's one for you. On the dynamics of the very top of the market in China, I mean, one of the things... The reason, I mean, if you're Volkswagen, I think you're in enormous trouble in China. They've lost market share, hand over fist. What market share they still have is mainly internal combustion engine vehicles. The EV share, not great. I have to say that at least at Shanghai, they unveiled a reasonably compelling set of new vehicles, which I don't think will be...
3 concepts.
Yes, but not as disastrous as the one they unveiled in Beijing, which looked awful. And they said, here's our new car. Well, it'll be on the roads in 2027 or something like that. You thought, I think that's going to be a little bit too late. Look, but for BMW and Mercedes, although they're losing market share, it hasn't been as catastrophic as what's happened to Volkswagen. I'm told that's because at the very top end of the market, the rich Chinese buyers regard EVs as something then don't really want to get involved in. They're the sort of cars for the masses, and they still want their S-Class to have a petrol engine up the front. But clearly that's unsustainable in the long term. And what I would ask you is, are these buyers at the top end of the market going to be seduced by a Neue Klasse or a top of the range Mercedes EV in the same way that they might still be clinging on to buying petrol powered versions of the fanciest BMWs and Mercedes and Audis?
In its simplest terms, Simon, I think that because there are so many brands, originally just in the mass market, but now in the premium side with Yangwang, but then you look at NIO, and this is where this huge kind of schizophrenic, the ES8, the flagship SUV from NIO, now starts at around $40,000.
Wow,
this thing would sell for $80,000-$90,000 in Europe or the United States, and so it's going to squeeze these margins. I look at Tesla and its resilience in the China market, and I think Chinese consumers, a good share of them, are just like, there's way too many choices. I trust Tesla, or I trust BMW, or I trust Mercedes. And we have to peel the layers of the onion back a little bit. The 7 Series, the i7, the EQS, not very good tries from the premium side. And so maybe second, third generation, this Neue Klasse. And my moles in Germany tell me that BMW is leaning heavily into this for the Munich, for IAA mobility. So I think we're going to see a lot of advertisements and marketing for the Neue Klasse. But the risk is that they're in no man's land a little bit. And at least BMW has said, from a marketing standpoint, this is our software, this is our hardware. It's going to be DNA for all of our vehicles. I think Mercedes, Audi has the AUDI brand, but that A5 Sportback is a little bit, again, in no man's land. And so you can't win in China unless you have something very compelling that creates a lot of value. And I think Tesla is the perfect example. Get a serviceable product or number of products in the clean energy space, and I think there's room for the premiums to kind of claw back a little bit of market share.
And how important is it? Sorry.
Oh, sorry. Simon, go ahead.
No, I mean, just want to ask how important you think the sort of the driving experience, the software that defines that is important, is that part of the market? Because one of the things I noticed at the Shanghai show was there were an awful lot of cars from an awful lot of brands in the sort of mid-market that looked almost exactly the same. Even the multi-brand companies like BYD, they're different brands. All the cars resembled each other as far as I could tell. I just don't know how you would choose a car in China if you were going on looks alone. So presumably there must be something else going on. I just wonder if the Europeans are catching up with the tech that the Chinese buyer demands.
So in Volkswagen and Stellantis' case, they're borrowing the tech or licensing that tech from the Chinese automakers or the Chinese EV makers. Now, there are practical reasons. When you talk about performance specifically, you look at a Porsche, you look at the M series BMWs and the high-end BMWs with the high displacement engines. There's no Autobahn in China. So no one's really going to be driving their i7 or 5 Series 200 kilometers on any highway in China unless they want to get caught by the traffic police. And so there are practical use cases that are different, but I just don't know if the Chinese consumer really understands how to get the most out of a high displacement vehicle or a high horsepower vehicle. And I think most young people are stuck in traffic all day, so they're much more concerned about how does this connect Bluetooth with my phone in order for me to seamlessly deal with this traffic without pulling my hair out.
Yeah, I mean, you touch on one of the big mysteries of the car industry. The only place you can test out the full performance of almost any car would be on a German Autobahn anywhere in the world, as far as I can see. I mean, that's the only place you can go that fast. I don't know if you've driven a Range Rover off-road, but they're the most incredibly capable off-road vehicles if you get the chance to drive one. No customer ever takes them off-road. I mean, they talk about capability, and this is the sort of thing, you're buying this capability. None of this performance, none of this capability is ever tested anyway. I mean, explain that to me.
Well, you've touched on something that's fascinates me, but I mean, I call the I call this the Bruce Springsteen complex, where you think you're gonna drive all night, you're gonna head out from your home in Baltimore, Jack, and take a wrong turn, never come back, which is not how most people live anywhere, right? I mean, to agree about China. I mean, yes, in the United States, I mean, we have these wide open spaces and all of that. Take a trip across the country, and I'm definitely thinking about, what am I going to do in Nebraska? But most people don't do that. But the thing is, right, that car company, Range Rover or Land Rover is a great example. Their profit totally depends on people buying into that myth and spending up by the thousands of pounds and dollars and euros to own that capability. So, I mean, I think it's hard for the auto companies. They've seen that selling excess capability is a way to profit. And I think that's part of the challenge with the sort of the shift of large chunks of their audience or their potential audience, Chinese consumers, younger consumers, to kind of valuing more this digital experience. And I know over the last couple of weeks, there's been articles written and surveyed. I think Gartner had a survey come out just in the last couple of weeks showing yet again, right, that the legacy car companies are terrible at the digital side of the experience. So I do wonder, kind of as the terms of competition and the terms of value in the industry shift from, horsepower, ultimate off-road capability, the stuff that the legacy companies are good at, to, the digital connectivity and kind of digital apps and services, just how that's going to go. Because we've been talking 10 years plus about this digital capability gap with the legacy car companies, maybe 20, and yet it hasn't changed. So again, when you go to Munich, I want to see if BMW in particular, which I think is going to use the Neue class to say, oh yeah, we can do this digital stuff. Just let's look at this. I wonder if they're going to be convincing, because that seems to be the next frontier for these companies.
Simon, I'm gonna press rewind. About 3 years ago, you'd written about the inability of the legacy automakers to do software. This was 3 years ago. So Simon was a bit prescient on this, because I think there was also a couple articles recently that poo-pooed the legacy auto capabilities of software development and the digital services. So can you talk a little bit about this article you wrote 3 years ago?
Oh, sure. I mean, it's a long time ago. It's sort of recollecting exactly what I said is maybe slightly tricky, but it did exactly as you say. It just pointed out that companies that had relied for 100 years, or an industry that had relied for 100 years or more on their prowess in mechanical engineering and the intricacies of the internal combustion engine, that's all being turned over by electrification. And indeed, the idea that what consumers will demand from their car is the experience of driving, which will be defined by the software that controls things like the infotainment systems. And that's why, it's really no surprise that in China, for example, Xiaomi is doing so incredibly well, because that is essentially a technology company that has decided to make cars. And that's probably the way around you need to do it these days. Tesla, that's exactly how they presented themselves in the early days before they decided they were a robo-taxi and robot company of the future. The legacy of the car companies includes that sort of thinking that the mechanical engineering comes first, and that's almost, it's not irrelevant for EVs, but it's much less important. It's not what people are buying into.
It's not the main dish anymore.
Precisely. But the problem for the car companies has been, one, to set up a system whereby the software isn't something you sort of add on at a later date. It's almost the first thing you should be starting with. And you should be building the car around the software, not the software around the car. And I think that's one of the problems that the car companies faced. Setting up a system within where, the software designers would have primacy, even equality with the mechanical engineers. I'm not sure that's been solved. I think one of the other problems was getting the right kind of people. If you're a mechanical engineer, the very pinnacle would be to go and work for a Mercedes or a BMW. If you're a software engineer, it's sort of almost an admission of failure that you haven't got a job in Silicon Valley with Google or something like that, and you work for a car company.
Yeah, Yeah. I mean, this is a whole other podcast, which we won't do, but I'll just offer as an aside that, here out in Silicon Valley, right? There's this insane price war going on for AI engineers. I mean, people are being paid, you know,
Yeah.
9-figure bonuses to go to work for Facebook or Meta, rather, whatever. Well, the car companies can't afford that, and yet they too are now being pushed into being AI companies, or at least to a significant degree. So you're right. I mean, it seems like a very difficult challenge.
One of the
It comes
Go ahead, Simon.
it comes on top of all the other challenges, electrification, battery supply chains, the whole thing, everything's sort of changing for the car industry at once. And I think software was one of the things that they should have put at the top of the list, and it probably came sort of halfway down.
So a couple of things that I'll make a comment. When I was a young buck working in the automotive sector in a prior life, one of the veteran guys that sat at my queue, he was like, look, this is legacy automaker number one that I happened to work at the time. He was like, you open the hood of a Japanese car, all the hoses, they seem to go the same direction, and then everything seems to just look very neat and tidy. You open the hood of an American car, you got hoses going all over the place because the Americans built the car and then crammed the engine inside. And the Japanese did the exact opposite. And I think that's what you're alluding to a little bit. And one thing, and I'll throw this out there for both of you to comment, is the average age of a BMW buyer, Mercedes buyer, even a Cadillac buyer in China is 20 years younger, 25 years younger than it is in Europe and the United States or North America. Do you feel that all this technology, the digital advantage that these Chinese EV makers have in China will be lost in the West, in Europe, in the United States? Or do you think providing that value is going to be enough? One of the biggest challenges, and in China, it's kind of turned on its head, is that brand doesn't matter anymore in China, or is not as important. Look at Porsche as a prime example. I don't think that's the case in Europe or the United States or North America. So there's this built-in loyalty awareness that the legacy automakers have, that if they can quickly put a cool product out there, then maybe they can protect that market share a little bit better. But, what are your thoughts collectively?
Simon, you first.
Yeah. I mean, I agree. But on the other hand, I think the sort of another thing that's changed about the car industry is this idea about brand. I mean, it was always Audi's the example. It would take 20 years to build a premium brand. That was the sort of the industry law, and that I think was turned on its head by Tesla. So I'm not convinced now that brand matters so much. Certainly in the mass market. I mean, I think brand loyalty is much, much lower, and buyers in the mass market are looking for a bargain. If I look out my window right now, I mean, I can see a couple of MGs parked just over the road. MG has done fantastically well in the UK because they've got pretty good cars, very good prices. And I think that's the sort of thing that the buyers in the mass market sort of concerned about. So I think their brand loyalty definitely breaking down. Does it break down in the premium market? Well, that's a good question. I mean, I think if I were a premium car maker, I wouldn't rely on the brand keeping them afloat indefinitely. I think it gives them a little bit more breathing space to bring out sort of compelling electric vehicles. But I don't think it's the sort of defensive wall that it might have been in the past. Having said all of that, what has a brand promised you other than the fact that I've got a BMW outside my house, aren't I cool? That badge on the front of the car is saying, not only do you have a BMW, you've got, or a Mercedes, or even a Vauxhall Opel, whatever it is. That's saying if you bought this car new and it goes wrong, we'll probably fix it for you. One of the big problems for the Chinese car makers in Europe and wherever they've expanded is establishing that brand will have that same promise. Will it have the same sort of backup? Will it have the same servicing network? I mean, these are sort of the sort of dull bits under the bonnet of the industry, but I think they're incredibly important. And it's not clear that even for Tesla, that's pretty much still a work in progress, I would argue. And for the Chinese car makers, they need to continue succeeding. They need to convince buyers that they will have this servicing and backup network to keep those cars on the road if they do go wrong.
I agree with a lot of that. And just another beat on this, on the point about sort of what happens after the sale. I mean, look at Honda and Toyota in the United States. First of all, they build very good vehicles. Their quality is still, close to the best or the best in the industry. But what they're very good at, and I think Honda even perhaps the best of all amongst the mass market brands, is one that after sales service, but also managing their business such that their vehicles hold value, so that when somebody turns up at the dealership 4, 5 years, 6 years later, right, and says, "Oh, I want to trade it in," that vehicle has value. Tesla, I think, has not done a very good job of that of late. I mean, the price is bouncing all over the place. Their used values, again, in the United States, it may be different in other markets, but in the United States, their used vehicle values have crashed. And so that part is really important. And you're right. I'm sure you're right that outside, if you were even inside China, perhaps too, that sort of managing the brand value and the value of vehicles over a life cycle, that's still something they have yet to prove they can do. But just, coming to loyalty, I think later this week, S&P is, a former Polk, is going to do their loyalty survey and talk about, and I'm going to be interested to see how that looks, because I think the auto industry, is certainly in the West, is still kind of laboring in the shadow of the baby boom and older Gen X. And we're different people, right, than the people they're going to have to sell to over the next 20 years, which is millennials and Gen Y. And again, that's a whole other podcast, which I submit we shouldn't do right now. But it'll be interesting, that generational divide in terms of brand loyalty, importance of tech versus other attributes. I think that's a cliff, and that the industry is looking out over. And right now, it's hard to see that changes there, because people like me are still kind of buying vehicles and hogging the screen. But in 10 years, we're not going to be there. And what they do after that, I think, is going to be much more challenging.
I think you're right. I mean, sorry,
go ahead, Simon.
Go. I just think, you're absolutely right. The sort of questions of ownership versus usership, I think, extends to the car industry as well. The question of, whether robo-taxis take over completely. As you say, all debates for a separate podcast, I would suggest, but you're absolutely right that there are other big questions hanging over the car industry.
Yeah.
So I
Drew,
think
go ahead.
I think the biggest thing is if and when the legacy automakers can get to 30, 40,000, I think they may see this blossoming of car buyership or car ownership from the younger generation, because the biggest constraint, or one of the biggest constraints, and I have nephews and nieces in their 20s, is the fact that a car price costs $52,000 in the United States. And so they're basically priced out of the market, and they borrow mom and dad's car, blah, blah, blah. But, and the fact that Uber is going to become a player, or wants to become a player, is also going to be a factor in the next 10 or 12 years as well. And I'm going to dovetail this, because we're going to wrap this up. But there is one question, Simon, and it has to do with autonomous vehicles. So I'm going to read it and have you answer it. What will EU and UK policy be on autonomous vehicles from China? Seems like they are making some inroads. So Mike, the car geek, has written that, and I want to say, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, he's also talking about the data security and data privacy aspects.
I think that's a very good question. I think it's unclear. I mean, I think the policy towards autonomous vehicles in general is still being thought out, should we say? And it's something where I think they should be hurrying up thinking about, because we don't want Europe to fall behind in the race to autonomy simply because we don't have the policies in place that allow testing. And I mean, the UK has done some good work on this. I mean, there are relatively permissive policies in place. I think Wave and Uber.
Well, you have a national champion in Wave, right? So.
Yes, absolutely. I mean, they're going to start with Uber. They're going to start testing autonomous vehicles in London. But I mean, I think clearly China and the US are way ahead. Whether the data concerns, an interesting question. I mean, if you look at the attitude to Huawei, both of the US and in Europe, the perceived dangers of the Chinese government hoovering up data and using that for whatever means they may want to use it for, but, clearly reasons that we'd be slightly uncomfortable with. I think the same would go for Chinese autonomous vehicles or Chinese vehicles in general that are hoovering up data with cameras all over the place. But whether the EU or Britain could do anything about that or will do anything about that is, again, very unclear to me.
So the Biden administration on its way out actually addressed that in the United States through, I want to call them executive actions, Joe, but I'm not sure if they are or not, what the precise name of them are, but they had restricted Chinese connected software for model year 27 and Chinese connected hardware for model year 30. Now it becomes an enforcement thing, I think, with the Trump administration and beyond, whether or not they want to enforce those rules. But that could be another restriction without creating quotas for the Chinese EV makers to enter the United States. That being said, we are rounding the corner to 10 o'clock. So Joe, Simon, I'm going to give both of you guys the opportunity to have the last word before we wrap it up. So go ahead, Simon.
I'm going to go ahead on that very question about EVs. I mean, look, the barring Chinese EVs for data concerns, I think that the job was done with 100% tariffs even before Biden decided that the data was a problem. As the Chinese localize, which they will have to do if they want to become global car makers, I think that will make it much easier to keep tabs on what's going on inside Chinese cars. And so I wonder if the Chinese government really think that the main prong of their sort of intelligence gathering exercises in the West is really going to be their car industry, because the moment it's discovered that that's what's going on, I think that'll be the end for them. So I'm a little bit skeptical on that.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. I think the Beijing, from whatever I can see and read, Beijing wants their car industry to succeed globally, and anything that gets in the way of that, I think they'll probably make sure it doesn't happen. And controlling the supply chain, controlling the technology is kind of what they're up to. And if they have to sacrifice a little bit of spy capability, I think I would do that if I were them, because the opportunity, the monetary opportunities is so great other way around. Look, it's been a fun conversation, Simon. Thank you.
I really
for
enjoyed
coming on. It's been a lot of fun too. Always a good time. And look forward to doing this again fairly soon after my trip west.
Simon, good to see you, and we'll see you in a week. And Joe, enjoy your trip out west. We'll schedule another one likely in the next couple of weeks. If Joe's not available, maybe we'll have a guest host in his stead. So everyone, thanks for joining us. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. We will see you very soon again.